Hello and welcome to Life on Scribe. And today we're going to be talking about Magic, a very short introduction by Owen Davies. Obviously this is a very short introduction, so you're not going to get anything very in-depth or reality-shattering, but what is there is very interesting. The book covers magic from an external, dispassionate and objective point of view, going through different views of it through history and even across different countries and cultures. It shows you just how difficult it can be to define magic when we take these different views and cultures into consideration. But it also gives you a good understanding for the viewpoints behind each attempted definition, as well as their flaws or limitations. Some of the books in the Very Short Introduction series can be, despite their title, anything but a short introduction made for newcomers to a topic, and are instead quite heavy, wordy, and inaccessible. This book does not fall into that trap. It's a clear, easy read that covers its topics well, and will probably even surprise you with a few of its observations or topics covered. The chapters are as follows: Introduction, Initial Observations, Anthropologies of Magic, Historical Perspectives, All in the Mind, Writing Magic, Magic in the Modern World, and Final Thoughts. I'm tempted to say that I feel like the Historical Perspectives chapter should come before the Anthropologies of Magic, because it feels more natural to start with a history of magic and where it came from, or where it's believed to have come from, and so to start from a more European heart. But that's probably why Davies starts with the anthropology section, to shake you out of that thought process and to immediately show you the complexities of trying to categorise magic and how, even if we have a good definition that works in the West, it gets complicated as soon as we encounter other cultures. Because of this, the anthropology section is very interesting, even though you subsequently feel a little bit catapulted back in time when you hit the historical perspective chapter. My only real criticism of the book is that you don't really end up with a definition of magic by the end of it, but this is also a criticism mixed with understanding that this is partially the point. Davies is showing us how hard it is to define magic, depending on what time we're in, what worldview we start from, and what cultures we encounter, amongst many other factors. Having said that, by the end of the book it does feel like magic is defined as any physical act that could engender a response. That response being a psychological one in effect, but it could be viewed as external or actual by the practitioner of magic. The problem with this is that it also encompasses many religious practices, and while from an external view, a mechanical point of view, I understand it, I don't think that many of the religion's adherents would be happy to be told that they were practicing magic. This is also slightly odd, as Davies spends a lot of time in the anthropology section showing how wrong the Western attempts to debase indigenous religions or to view their practices, their magic, as signs of lack of maturity, how wrong this was. So it may be problematic to then sweep religion into this category of magic without offering a similar discussion on the views of the adherents. I will return to this problem later with some examples and my own thoughts. I'd also like to point out that if you want to read about magic in the modern neo-pagan sense, then this isn't the book for you, as it doesn't cover that side at all. So all in all, I would say this book is a very interesting read and I would recommend it. That's the short review. If you want to stick around to hear what I have to say on specific points it makes or topics it brings up, then please stick around. We're going to talk about some of the history it covers, including old views of magic and religion, various definitions of magic, magic and writing, which was a section I found particularly interesting, sympathetic magic, and psychology, among other topics. So if you're leaving now, please remember to do all the YouTube things, and I'll see you next time. Right, to those who have stayed, let's get into it. As I mentioned, Davies opens the book by discussing how complex magic is to define, how everyone from philosophers and theologians to anthropologists and historians have tried, how even in modern parlance and science the word magic is used and has a common understood meaning. He tells us how each definition of magic is a product of its time, from European Enlightenment, viewing anything magic as a sign of primitivism, to the modern use as a superlative term in the West, and while still being a much used and much feared practice in other parts of the world. He then goes on to give us the history of the word magic, coming from Magi later, in the East, and the Persian magus. It came to Greece and became magia, As it came from this foreign land, magic was thus something foreign, and this built into the definition, the Greek definition of magic. This point is also made in Witchcraft, a very short introduction by Malcolm Gaskill, where he talks about magic in relation to religion of the time, saying how in ancient Greek magic was a pejorative, as it was an unregulated power. These men and women were seen to assume state authority and so fulfill the law. And it was more of a distinction between their own orthodox religion and magic and these stable foreign equivalents. Here magic is a negative thing. Davies tells us how Sophocles refers to a magos as a crafty begging priest, while another source refers to the tricks of the magi. Another interesting point Davies brings up is magic in relation to Zoroastrianism, and the idea that their priests wandering westwards to spread their religion was seen as magoi, infecting the Hellenistic world with their magic, especially with the Persian advance into Greek territory in the 480s. This was an interesting idea I'd not heard before, as I knew it was a foreign practice not approved of by the state, but not the idea that it might have come from Zoroastrianism. Davies touches on magic through Jewish, Christian and Islamic lenses, showing how they grappled with the idea, how they tried to identify and define magic and possible strands of magic to see if they were acceptable within their religions. Still, here we rarely get the idea that magic is positive, though by medieval times we begin to see the appearance of the terms natural magic, which was viewed as the key to unlocking the hidden properties of the material environment, which were the wonders and secrets of God's world. But it was not the vanity of other cultures' religions. However, though people were prepared to accept that magic could have a rational if false basis, and that the power of magic as a rhetorical tool was ever dominant, on the whole, the practice of magic continued to be defined in terms of the deceitful claims and strange practices of foreign magicians and priests. Furthermore, all religions had times when they were accused of practicing magic as a way of discrediting them and their practices. Gaskill touches on this also, as I mentioned in a previous video, saying that the charge of witchcraft was never uniquely associated with one faith or another, but generated by conflicts between faiths, meaning that the dominant religion of the time often accused the other of practicing magic of being a witch. Thus, back in the day, Christians were accused of black magic and other crimes that angered the gods. Davies gives the example of the Christian Eucharist and the worship of the Holy Trinity, giving ammunition to Jewish and Islamic critics. From this we can see that magic and religion are intertwined and opposed. Intertwined because of the shifting nature of accepted orthodox belief, and opposed as magic tends to be defined as negative, unacceptable practices. However, Davies links religion and magic by saying, the aim of this introduction has been to show how magic is inexorably intertwined with the development of religion as a process of cultural negotiation. What looks like magic from the outside is understood by those being studied or condemned as the legitimate, practical application of religious worship, the everyday employment of religion for reasons other than spiritual enlightenment or salvation. This is true to a certain extent, and certainly an understandable definition from an anthropological point of view. But it does muddy the waters and doesn't show why religion would want to condemn some of these magical practices. Gaskill shows us some of these reasons by using Greece and later Christianity as an example. The fact that the power of demonies, to use the Greek term, might be directed against personal enemies intensified official hostility. Such practices were not only antisocial, they usurped the right of the state to settle disputes and inflict punishment. This concern formed a template adapted and applied repeatedly in the Christian era, most famously in Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries, amidst intense political and legal centralisation. I think this context is important. People weren't banning magic simply because they hadn't put an official stamp of authority on it, or as a simple opposition of religion versus magic, with one culture versus another, which you could be mistaken for thinking with Davies' definition. They were banning it because they viewed it as dangerous. Firstly, from a legal point of view, in that you don't want people exacting their own revenge left, right and centre for every petty problem, and later within a Christian sense at least, because it was viewed as a moral threat to everyone, and that magic came from the devil. Christianity tried to define the difference between God's miracles, miraculi, and demonic illusions, mira, with the church trying to teach that the pagan gods were demons and the magicians drew upon satanic power whether they realised it or not. Davies also discusses the idea of magic being viewed as a primitive form of belief, which was held in the 19th century, and which he shows to be very problematic. Hegel, for instance, developed a model in which there were 3 stages of religion, which were religions where nature was imbued with spirits, religions of elevated individual extraterrestrial gods, and finally Christianity, which he considered the consummate synthesis of the other 2. We see how in this model magic was the oldest, rawest and crudest form of religion. Many of us have probably grown up surrounded by this idea. Indeed, in the early part of the 21st century we saw discussions picking up on this thread and adding another step to it, arguing that it wasn't Christianity but atheism that was this pinnacle of the evolution of beliefs. Not that this was a new view. It was introduced first to the wider public by James Fraser in The Golden Bower, in which he put forward a 3-stage model of human intellectual development from magic to religion to science. But such evolutionary views of history are flawed. We lose nuance and understanding by trying to place everything as a race to the finish, one as the pinnacle and the rest as flawed. Gaskell echoes a similar feeling that this is limited and flawed in his book, saying that seeing witchcraft as a culturally embedded idea changes the usual assumptions that it was a category mistake, a surrender to emotion, a badge of ignorance. Not only did the witch beliefs make sense, then continued to make sense, but they deliver truths about the universe. Davies shows us many other definitions and distinctions, including Emily Durkheim's view that religion was characterised by social integration and shared values and experiences. Churches were expressions of community. Magic, on the other hand, was concerned with transactions between individuals. Or Wittgenstein saying that magic gives wish a representation, it expresses a wish. It was a symbolic language. These are just a few examples, and Davies goes into multiple of these and gives the responses of people at the time as they debated these definitions back and forth. That's quite an interesting section. Davies shows how people tried to give magic a more positive definition at times, such as with Gabriel Nodé, who distinguished between lawful and unlawful magic. Lawful included divine magic, called mosaical magic, such as prophecies, miracles, and speaking in tongues, and the theurgic magic, he also included natural magic, or the ability of the philosopher to understand occult properties, which he viewed as acceptable. However, Giotic/Theotic, or demon magic, was condemned, as men should not imagine any other author of this perverse and unlawful magic than Satan. We see this as an attempt to classify acts as well as to set limits on what was and wasn't acceptable from within a tradition by an individual. However, Davies also discusses how Christianity created a divide between it and magic, and equated magic with paganism, i.e. all other religions that were not Judaism and Christianity. Magic was demonic, and the gods and spirits worshipped by other beliefs were really demons. As such, the origin of magic lay in hell, as humans could not perform magic without demons. Later on, we see the understanding that if natural magic was occult science, demonic magic was heresy, and that by then, magic was no longer an expression of paganism, but instead the perversion of Christianity. Even within this framework, there are different definitions and breakdowns. Occultist Alpheus Levi distinguished between the magic of Abraham, Confucius, Zoroaster, Enoch, and the like. Magic he viewed as transcendental science, absolute science, and Sanskrit magico-religious texts. Believing that India had been founded by the descendants of the vanished biblical Cain, Levi saw it as the home of black magic, greater and pernicious works of illusion. So as you can see, magic, religion and science have an interesting history, entwining as different people define different things and define themselves in regards to different things. In another part of the book, Davies also points out the false narrative we give of the witch trials, saying, the triumphal histories of witchcraft written in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which depict the witch trials as product of irrational, unscientific medieval mind, and the end of the witch trials as a product of modern scientific revolution were misguided in their understanding of the period and naive in their espousal of evolutionary models of progress. I've talked about this in depth in another video, which I will link wherever that goes, and I'll probably do another one soon, so I won't get into it here, but it's good that Davies brings this up in his book. Davies also explains how Protestants tried to get rid of magic, but how it actually ended up promoting certain aspects of magic by having an emphasis on possession of the Bible, and the promotion of access to it. Well, it facilitated widespread magical use of the Bible in popular culture. He returns to this later in the chapter Writing Magic, when discussing magical books from different religions, or maybe more accurately, how religious books were used for magic. He gives examples of passages from the Torah/Old Testament being recited for healing or protective purposes, the Bible being kept under pillows for protection at night, or its pages being ingested to cure sickness, as well as the Apocrypha, which formed the basis of protective charms that circulated widely across Europe from the medieval period through to the 20th century, and even how the Quran was used and is used as a talisman in itself. He discusses charms and talismans, amulets in cars, and the mezuzah as an example of a Jewish amulet. I found this chapter particularly interesting. There is a lot more discussed in this book, even if it's not in depth. He talks about animal magnetism, from which hypnosis was derived, magical tricks magicians used, as well as the psychological and developmental side of belief in magic in children. We see that Davies begins to tie almost all acts, religious, superstitious, magical and ritual, under the label of magic as the book goes on, or this is certainly how it feels. Remember how I said that by the end of the book, his definition of magic feels like any physical act that could engender a response? Well, we're about to see why I say that. Firstly, it comes from his discussion on sympathetic magic, and secondly, from his definition of magical thinking in relation to God or the gods. Davies discusses the principles of sympathetic magic as a large part of how magic works, or a large part of how magic is believed to work. He explains how sympathetic magic is certainly a universal principle that derives from the basic association of ideas. At its simplest, it means like affects like, and that in magical terms, anthropologists have used it to describe the attempt not only to express but to manipulate reality by means of its image. A good, clear definition of this aspect of magic, however, he then goes on to bring in Marcel Mauss's criticism of Frazer for being overly dogmatic in proposing that the law of sympathy was a defining characteristic of magic, but not religion. After all, what is the making of the sign of the Christian cross if not an act of sympathetic association? We'll return to this point in just a moment. Later, Davies talks about the idea of magical transference of disease, which is a form of contagious magic, worked through the laws of sympathy. That being that when things have been in contact with each other, a link remains between them. People believed ailments that were caused naturally or supernaturally could not be destroyed, and so the only means of cure was to pass on the ailment to others through some ritual act. And finally, he states that believing that a god or gods can influence earthly affairs or determine our existence after death is essentially magical thinking, as understood in developmental psychology. Now, I'd like to break this down, and this is just my opinion based on my research and understanding, so take it or leave it, but I think this is too broad a definition of magic, and it's becoming unhelpful. If we look at magic as any physical act that could engender a response, which is just my way of summarising what I think we've got to at this point in the book, then we're left with several problems and no answers. If we take sympathetic magic for a start, basis of magic, though not an all-encompassing law, as he has pointed out, then Christian miracles, for example, would not fall into this category. And to take the idea of the sign of the cross, that feeds into a difference on the way I think magic functions, which I feel is missed somewhat from this text, but is something I have observed in the way practitioners talk about magic, cause and effect. But I'll come back to this in just 1 second. Davies brought on the idea of transference of illness by sympathetic magic. This too surely sets some religious acts or miracles apart from magic then. To take the example of a miracle, the healing of the paralytic at Capernaum, this is not being passed to anyone. The illness is gone. Another example would be a priest's blessing given to heal a person, but again, this wouldn't be magic, again because cause and effect. And what do I mean by that? I mean that magic is very causal. It is a belief that if something is done in a certain way, an effect will occur. Of course, there are clauses or reasons given for why the desired effect might not come about, but in its heart, it is in essence almost a way of ensuring an outcome. As Durkheim's definition puts it, it is a transaction. And with a transaction comes the desire of certainty from the part of the purchaser. Now, on the other hand, the sign of the cross, a blessing, prayer even, is not causal, even if the believers sometimes mistakenly believe it to be. It is not cause and effect, a transaction between the actions of the believer and God. Just because you ask for a blessing or protection doesn't mean you're going to get it. In this way, in theory, even when calling the Holy Spirit down in church, the priest doesn't command, but asks for its presence within the community. It's not a spell, not a summoning, not a causal link between the words and actions of the priest and God being compelled to act a certain way. In theory, he could not show up at all, but the people trust that he will. Another thing I would add to this distinction is the sense of personal power. A lot of magical practitioners have talked, and still talk to this day, about their power to do something, to summon something, or to create something, or to alter a situation. Religious belief and ritual is a petition, a request. You are asking a power outside yourself to do something. You are not commanding it, not controlling it, nor able to make the change yourself. That would be part of the definition I would make between magic and religious practice, though there is still overlap. For example, acts thought to make it rain, such as rainmaking dances or ceremonies, could overlap in that they could be viewed as magic if the practitioner believes their personal power will compel a deity to act with certainty, or that they themselves have the power to do so by doing these actions. Or it could be viewed as religious if it is an act of petition, a way of getting the attention of the gods or entities they are asking to make changes. This is just an illustrative example, not a judgment or discussion on the various rainmaking practices, past and present throughout the world. Hopefully, though, you see my point. To a certain extent, though, coming from the other direction, i.e. implying religious acts as magic, it feels like Davies says something similar when saying that mechanistic forms of worship, such as prayer and ritual, can be perceived as either magical or religious depending on who performs it and in what context. And it does depend on context, or the context I would say being the position of the practitioner, supplicant or master. Are you requesting or are you ordering? This is my attempt at making a distinction. Some may agree, others may disagree. As we can see, the definitions of magic have been varied throughout space and time. What sort of distinction would you make? Would you make one at all? I'd be curious to know, although keep the discussion civil in the comments. Overall, this book is very interesting and raises a lot of good points, as well as providing good jumping off points for further reading. The references section at the back points you towards other books based on the chapters they were in, they were referred to in, and the ideas put forward in the book make you want to read more about this very broad but interesting topic. I hope you enjoyed this review and the little discussion about some of the points I found noteworthy. If you like the video and want to hear more from me, the buttons are below. I'm sure you all know what to do by now. If you want, you can also find me on other platforms which I've linked below, so come and say hi and see what I'm doing. And that's about all I have for this week, so thank you for listening and I'll see you again soon. Bye! Hello, baby. Are you helping? Are you gonna say hi? Hello. Oh, you're helping with the video? They put me down.